Hello and welcome to Woman Vision TV. It's where women talk. I'm Nadia Giordana and I have a fun and interesting guest today, Travis-Odefey. She is an expert on preserving family heritage. Let's go talk to her and find out more about that. Jean, welcome to the show. I'm glad you could be here today.
Well, thank you, Nadia. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's get right down to it. You are an expert on preserving family heritage. How did you get started doing that?
Well, I got started in the late 70s when I interviewed my father on a tape with my children in the background screaming. And that was my first foray into it. And then I really took a little vacation while I raised my children in the 80s. In the early 90s, I offered a word processing class, that was back in WordPerfect days, on how to learn the word processor. And it was based on writing your life story. And that was really kind of a popular summer class that I taught based on that. And at that time, I used a book that was really probably the first book ever written on the topic. It was a book by Frank Thomas, and he gave me the idea for the timeline. And so at that time, I developed my own timeline, and then I started writing my own stories. With that, then in the early 2000s, I took a class from Denny Ledoux, who's the author of this book, Turning Memoirs into Memories. And I took it in Montreal and came home thinking I'm going to teach classes and really enjoy this, which I have done. And I've taught classes just here and there, wherever they come to me, usually in senior settings, and sometimes I just bring my own group of people together when I know someone who wants to take it, and they come to my home or we meet somewhere else, and I give them the basics of how to get started. And that is just kind of a little rough outline of how I got started. And it's just something that's, I don't know how you describe what's in your heart to do, but it is.
It's a passion.
It is. It is a passion, and I have kept it up. And we talked earlier about do what you love and the money will follow. And I just do what I love, period. And that's it. But I've found other avenues to take as I've gone through, and I added to the timeline. I always like to sort of massage the materials, and I added to the timeline by putting in historical events in my chart and turning points.
I like the idea of adding historical events. That gives us a perspective, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It makes a difference. For example, that I was born after World War II started, and the look on my mother's face could possibly not be that I was her sixth child and she was tired, but perhaps she could have been worrying about the war at the time. My Montreal writing group gave me that bit of information, and at every workshop I've ever done, people come out learning things and looking at things in a little different ways sometimes, which is really nice.
So you got started then long before it became popular. I think about 10 or 15 years ago, it became a lot more popular in our culture. I even got started with my family history, dug out old photos, hand pulled. It was an awful lot of work. Some 3-ring binder, but like scrapbooking kind of books, and pulled as much together as I could. Then I duplicated those for about 10 family members. And oh, what a lot of work. So I haven't gone back and revisited that since then. It would be interesting to see if I could duplicate one of those books or not.
Right.
But so it got popular a few years back and people were doing it, but you've been doing it all along.
I have, and I have found what I think are the best resources as well. And I'm here to say for everyone that I'm putting together a guide about how I do this and what my system is. And in that, I'll list what I think are what I know are my most favorite resources. And there's a current one today, and it's on the healing aspects of writing. And it's a marvelous book, and that will be in there. But yes, many things have been written, and I probably have read most of them in those years. But I just remember starting out with, I gave my parents just little books, they were supposed to write down answers to questions, and of course they would write down 1 or 2 words, and of course,
I know, yeah, people do that.
they do that. And if we don't follow through with more than who, what, where, when, and sometimes they don't even get that in there, with how did you feel about it, what was happening at the time, and all of that, then we don't have really a good basis for a life story, or further on, a memoir if we want to produce one.
So someone out there who wants to get started, what would be some of the beginning steps to take to put together a family history?
Well, I think some of the beginning steps are to get a help from someone like me or someone else on how you get started. From what you mentioned, the organization, in my estimation, is huge.
Oh, I could have used a guide.
Well, I think a lot of people, like I hear the phrase, I should do that someday when I talk about this. And I think that tells me, number one, I'm not going to do it. Well, why am I not going to do it? Because I don't know how to write, and my response to that is, if you can talk, you can write. Nothing is organized. I think that's just a huge
It's
detriment.
daunting. It's a lot of work.
It's immense. And so I've developed a system where I filed my photographs, I filed memorabilia. It's not quite perfect, but I'm working on it for my little guide. And then I can access what it is I want to write. Example, I had a friend from high school who celebrated her 50th anniversary, and she didn't know how to work on a book. And so I said, well, I'll do it for you. So I'll use my Heritage Makers, and I use that because it's like PageMaker. I call it a mini PageMaker.
Okay.
So I can design, I can choose templates and refashion those. I can do whatever I want to, actually. And she didn't have the expertise, so I said, I'll do it for you for a gift, for your 50th, and I was her maid of honor.
Oh, nice.
So
that's a big gift.
Yeah, so she just sent me a whole packet of photos, which I have to start scanning. But the point I'm wanting to get to is that because I had filed my memorabilia, I took all my, orange albums, my photograph albums from the 70s. And I took other albums that I had put together, and I tore them apart and filed them.
Oh.
So I knew where her material was, and that's the key.
Yeah.
I mean, I have additional things that I can put in her album. I think she'll like that. So.
Is it easier going through older photographs, maybe not if they're all thrown into a box, but the way you did it, as opposed to the huge amount of, I find in recent couple of years that I have so many digital photos, I have no idea how I'm ever going to sort through those when I get back to this and do a continuation of what I was doing.
What I've done with my digital photos, because that's a whole new area, is, is that I keep them, what I do, this is a sample of a photo journal that I can show. But
yeah, show us that.
It's just pages and pages of journaling and photos with the story. So, for example, I go by months. I file my photos on my computer. I bring them in by year and month, by the date, and that's how I file them. And then I go in and rename after the date. I'll go in and rename the file with what it's about.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have these files, and I back them up on an external hard drive. And the other thing is that they are filed on Heritage Makers, so that if something blows up, I know that I can go out to Heritage Makers and get that
And filing with the date first. I've been doing it the other way around. The subject matter and the date, which is okay, but that's alphabetical in the way the computer sorts it. So the date would bring things right into,
Right.
I've just changed my method.
Well, good.
From here on forward.
Well, it's been helpful to me, and then my photos that are old photos,
Yeah.
I file those by years too. Now I know there's some cross-referencing that I can do,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but generally speaking, I file by the years, and it corresponds to my timeline. In that, you know, I've listed everything in my timeline from my birth on to now, and then I can go through my timeline and look at, you know, what photos might
Yeah.
correspond to that. And I also do it with memorabilia.
Now, how do you do the timeline? You've mentioned a timeline. Is that something you have on paper?
I do. I have it on paper. As I say, I started with Frank Thomas back in the 70s, and I go back and refer to what I have there. This little gem needs to be updated, but this is my basic book.
Yeah,
Just
oh,
turn
that's
it
good.
over.
Yeah, that's
Right,
actually,
and
that's
this has all my stories, and they're not all in here, but here's my Rosie the Riveter story about when I was born. And so I have all kinds of stories that I've done when I publish these on word processors, and I'd publish them for my children and bind them with the spiral binder, and give those to my children early on.
Yeah.
I also refer to letters from my siblings when my mother was in the hospital with me, and I was the only one born in a hospital. And I have those, and those are mini treasures. Let me tell you, they really are.
Very much.
But these are filed according to the decades. And
Okay.
so here's Drake University, Marriage, Des Moines Public Schools, because I taught there. And this section is not as full, but there's one story in there that's rather interesting. But I keep going, Drake and work, and I've just sectioned it basically by decades. And I also include photo sleeves, so I might want a photo sleeve in here. So if I want to write about the joys of being a baton twirler, then I have this photo right there.
Which I think would be fantastic.
Yeah. And so that's how, and by the way, that was a big move for me when I was 5 years old or whatever I was, to go into town and order a baton.
Yeah.
And then, the store owner called my mother and said, "Do you know your daughter did this?" So, there's just interesting stories about what I did and what it showed. Perseverance.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is really the main tool. I have many stories on my computer,
Yeah. Yeah.
and those are filed generally like this, but my big goal this year is to really tweak it and get it put together. So one of the people in my class that I took with Debbie Ledoux, turning memories into memoirs, and this was in Montreal, I asked her, I said, well, what if she had been to Saudi Arabia and she had a lot of interesting stories. And I said, well, are you going to publish those, or what are you going to do? And she said, well, maybe, but if I don't, I have this.
Yeah.
I have this, and so it's worth doing whatever you can do.
Yeah.
It really
You
is.
could use something like either one of those books to actually go back to and publish a regular memoir or autobiography. You could do that too if you wanted, and you'd have your material right
It's
there.
really the basis for everything you may want to write. And that's what I tell my people who come to workshops is, you have that, and then you can decide, because you have a lot of evaluation to do. Is this a book for the public?
Yeah.
Is this a book for just your family?
Yeah.
Who is this for? Is it just for your own healing? So there's a lot of reasons that people need to write, and then they have to look at what they want to do with it.
Yeah.
And above all, not to we always said in our classes not to get back at anyone or any of that kind of thing, but just to learn a lot about yourself as well. So, and I've changed stories all the time because I've grown.
Yeah.
You know, as I've progressed, I've grown more and more, and I have a new way
perspective
of
on the story. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's just an ongoing process.
I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much.
Right. So that's really kind of the basis of what I do. I know that in a few minutes we'll want to start talking about ethical wills, but let me just mention a couple things here that I think were significant. I helped a fellow who is a retired Minneapolis policeman do this book, and I prefer to help people by just coaching them on how to do it themselves.
That cover. Obviously, he's a fireman.
This is his son.
Okay.
This is his story about his son who died of cancer. And when I was previewing the book, and actually I edited and helped him all the way along, he did the work. So, and it's a way I prefer to work because I like teaching people to fish rather than giving them one. And he wrote this entire thing, this story, I should say, and we set it up just like a regular book. And he would talk about his son and his attributes. And
beautiful format.
It's just, he did a marvelous job, and it's a man I met several years ago. Actually, I met him at an Irish genealogy
What
conference.
did he use for the...
Well, this is Heritage. So,
okay, it's through Heritage.
So he has an account. I can get into his account if I have his password. So I can go in and say, well, try this, try that, do something, whatever. And then we can also send things back and forth. So I would know, for example, I would know of a graphic, like at the end, he has his family, in a, gee, wait a minute, I'll find it here. This little graphic.
Yeah,
okay?
The family
tree.
Yeah.
And so I knew where the graphic was, so I sent it to him on his site.
So you get to collaborate within the site.
Right online, we can collaborate. And with my sister, who just passed away, we shared a photo album online. And so we could just pass things back and forth, which I think is really kind of a nifty part of it. But his tribute is just so beautiful.
It really is. And it looks so good.
Yeah, so I think we got it to the point where talk about an ethical will. This is one for his son's children.
Nice.
It's just beautiful, and
nice.
He did it. I just love that.
He did a good job.
I do love that. So that's just one of many things that I've done. Another one is I did this cookbook for my mother and called all my siblings and said, send me your favorite memories of my mother.
Oh yes, I did something similar with my mom.
And it's so wonderful.
I like this format.
And I just, mention everything that they bring up. And again, it gives a picture of who my mother really was. Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a break.
Okay.
Then we're going to come back and talk about ethical wills and legacy letters.
Okay, we can do that. All right.
All right, well, we're back and we're talking about ethical wills and legacy letters. Are they the same thing? Are they different? Tell me about that.
Well, ethical wills encompass a whole range of things that you can create, from letters, just a simple letter. And people have described it as a love letter to your children, telling them what you admire about them and how they've carried forth your values. Because essentially, an ethical will is about your values, what you are all about, what you think about. For example, education, religion, a whole range of topics. And it's also about the lessons you've learned, what you hope to see in the future. And so you could write to a child and mention all of those things that you've seen in them that you admire.
Nice, yeah.
Which is wonderful, because unlike a regular will, which is, a bequeathing property.
Yeah, that's the nitty gritty, and it's
where
necessary.
people can get, yes, it's necessary, but it often leads to a disruptive
Sure.
type of thing going on in the family. An ethical will binds together, and it brings, if you want to say it, it brings love into the whole equation. Ethical wills can be written throughout a child's life. So for example, I've gotten to the point where I'm ready to write what I believe and what I see in my children right now. And it's come through all these years of writing life stories and finding out what I've learned from those life stories and what I'd like to pass on to my children. And I can update that. I mean, my children are in their, right at 40. And I can update that as long as I'm around to do it.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be just one
No.
letter in one time,
No.
does it? You can do it at different
No,
times.
you
yeah.
can do it at different times, and it becomes a piece of encouragement for them. They also can be read at funerals, which is a beautiful thing as well, because
That's the way I think of them, but they don't you don't necessarily have to wait until you're gone either,
No.
do you? Okay.
no, you just really don't. And so it's just becomes a real instrument that I think a lot of people, once they get into it and see what it's all about, they would really enjoy it.
Yeah.
And one thing that I found a lot of resources, but what I'm basing my ethical wills, I should say, is this book by Joe Klein Sebuhar.
That looks interesting.
And she is an attorney in Des Moines. Put a plug in for my home state, but at any rate, she has written So Grows the Tree, and she was involved with the Iowa Hospice group.
Sure.
And so she has a lot of really excellent helps in here for how to go about writing a life, an ethical will rather than a life story. I started to say life story. And so I'm using her guide, and also I'm beginning to learn that while I have this body of information that I want to write for my children, and they're going to raise their eyebrows, they're going to say, because my son always says, you sound like a teacher, and so they're going to raise their eyebrows, but I'm going to say, okay, I'm giving it to you anyway. This is me, and this is who I am, and this is what I see that I admire in you. So at any rate, it's coming. In just to start it out, I've already done some of it in the stories, and we talked about that just briefly in the first segment. My children have not paid attention, like many children don't, to what I'm doing, and they just, I did this with my parents. I listened to my father, and I go, okay, I've heard that story for the 20th time,
Yeah, and we kind of let it go through, and then later on when we try to remember, we wish we would have paid closer attention.
We really do, because we don't remember those stories that were told to us. So I decided, this was a 1986 trip that I took my children on to Yellowstone, and I did that because I had been there with my parents. And so I started with the story of my dream was to, it's pictures of me and my parents, and it's on this page, was to, and that's 1950.
Oh, yeah.
And we went to Yellowstone. Well, I wanted to stay in the Yellowstone.
Of
Old
course,
Faithful.
of
Yeah.
course.
And we couldn't do it. We had to
It
drive
was
right
probably
on.
too costly.
It was costly, and
Yeah.
we were on our way to California and all of that. So in 1986, I decided, okay, I'm going to do this. And I tried to find someone to go with me to help drive, but I couldn't. And so I did it anyway. And I took my mother, and her father had homesteaded in Wyoming. And I always joke about, oh, this is really smart, an Iowa farmer homesteading in Wyoming, where the sagebrush rolls. Well, we found the place where she was at age 5, which was just phenomenal to find it in the first place. And she kept meticulous notes about the trip. So I took those notes, and I took all the photos that we had taken, and I put my introductory letter to what we were supposed to do, and I put all the notes from her diary. And the diary showed how detailed she was about keeping notes. And so there were, you know, notes like this meal costs so much and that hotel costs so much, you know, all of this
And
detail.
later on, that is fantastic
Oh.
information.
It is. It's just
Yeah.
phenomenal to see the difference between.
Especially in
then-
100 years.
Yes, yes, exactly. But I gave it to my children, and by Christmas, it was for Christmas, and by Christmas night, both of my sons called and said, "Oh, this is just fabulous," and it was the first piece that they had commented about.
I'll bet they love it.
And they just loved it. So it's really a good example of, and in there it points out that my mother was conservative with her money, and she felt very indebted. She wanted to pay me back. You know, all of these qualities that
Yeah.
she had that I knew about. And in the back of it, I put a letter to her, even though she's deceased, and what I've learned since she died. So that was kind of interesting. Then the other piece that I think is quite unique is it's my son's wedding album. And in this wedding album is much different from any others that you'll see.
From the kinds that we ordinarily see.
From the kinds
sure.
that we ordinarily see, because it has the first story of how we met. And of course, I got this, I can just show it briefly, but I got this from my son, who calls me, and he calls me rarely, except when there's something big. And he had met the girl he was going to marry. And so
He knew.
He knew, and it keeps
That's important to put that in there.
well, it's something that no one would ever have in a
No.
wedding album.
No.
On top of that, which is the best part of it, is that my daughter-in-law had all the emails that they sent back and forth, because he had met
And
her
that's
sister.
what these are?
And these are all the emails.
Okay.
And the emails are about how are they going to recognize each other when they meet downtown.
Emails have finally come into their
They've
own.
come into their own, and so it's unique. And
Yeah.
at the I thought, oh, their kids are going to love this.
Yeah.
They're going to see the humor, you
Yeah.
know, involved in it, and all kinds of things. So I went through and generally put pictures with no captions, you know, and just left them. But everywhere there was something significant, like we all worked to get
Yeah.
the place ready.
Yeah.
And that story is in here, and so there are just lots of extra stories in an album that becomes, you know, really priceless and tells a lot about who they
So
are.
fantastic.
Yeah. So
Well,
it's
we're
fun.
running out of time.
Okay.
I see here, and we'll put this on the screen.
Okay.
Your website is lifestorykeepsakes.com.
Right.
And what other
Well-
other information we need, I'll put on the screen also
Right.
with that.
And that goes to my Heritage Maker site, but
Okay.
you can contact me through there.
Yeah. As
So-
long as your contact information is
Right.
there, that's good.
So that's
Good.
important.
Thank you
Okay.
very much
Well,
for
thank
coming on
you.
the show.